December 7th, 1941, arrived like any other Sunday morning across the Hawaiian Islands. With families preparing for church services and sailors aboard the USS Arizona enjoying their weekend routines, completely unaware that within hours their world would dissolve into flames and chaos. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor killed over 2,000 Americans in a single morning, transforming a nation that had desperately clung to isolationism into a unified force demanding vengeance and justice. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress the following day, his voice steady and resolute as he declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and with those words, America crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The nation that entered World War II bore little resemblance to the superpower it would become. Throughout the 1930s, America had watched Europe descend into darkness, with a mixture of concern and determination to remain uninvolved. The Great Depression had devastated the economy, leaving millions unemployed and hungry, their faith in government and capitalism shaken to its core. Isolationist sentiment ran deep through Congress and Main Street alike, fueled by bitter memories of World War I and a conviction that European conflicts were not America's concern. Yet beneath this surface of neutrality, currents of change had already begun stirring. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933 had alarmed many observers, but few imagined the scope of horror his regime would unleash. As Germany annexed Austria in 1938 and invaded Poland in 1939, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France, Americans debated fiercely about their role in the growing conflagration. Charles Lindbergh, the celebrated aviator, emerged as a leading voice for the America First Committee, arguing passionately that involvement in European wars would be disastrous for the nation. On the other side, interventionists warned that Nazi aggression threatened not just Europe, but the entire democratic world. President Roosevelt navigated these treacherous political waters with remarkable skill, publicly maintaining neutrality while quietly preparing the nation for the conflict he believed inevitable. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed America to supply war materials to Britain and other allies, effectively ending any pretense of true neutrality. Roosevelt understood what many Americans had not yet grasped, that the oceans no longer provided the protection they once had, and that fascism's triumph in Europe would eventually threaten American shores. According to research published in the Journal of American History, the transformation of American public opinion between 1939 and 1941 represented one of the most dramatic shifts in the nation's political history. The fall of France in June 1940 shocked Americans who had believed the French military invincible. Newsreels showing German troops marching through Paris brought the war's reality into American movie theaters, making the conflict suddenly feel closer and more threatening. Still, isolationist sentiment remained powerful, and Roosevelt knew that only a direct attack on American territory could unite the nation behind full-scale war. That attack came at Pearl Harbor, and it changed everything. Within days, millions of young men flooded recruitment centers eager to serve. The shock and rage that swept through the country dissolved political divisions almost overnight. America had been struck, and Americans would fight back with every resource at their disposal. The industrial giant was awakening, and the world would soon witness its full fury. January 1st, 1942, found America in a state of controlled chaos as the nation embarked on the most ambitious industrial mobilization in human history, transforming factories that had produced automobiles and refrigerators into vast assembly lines churning out tanks, aircraft and warships at a pace that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The phrase "arsenal of democracy," coined by Roosevelt in a fireside chat, became reality as American industry demonstrated a capacity for production that would ultimately prove decisive in winning the war. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the entire economic structure of the nation had been redirected toward a single purpose: victory. Detroit became the beating heart of this transformation. Henry Ford's massive Willow Run plant, which had been designed to manufacture civilian automobiles, was retooled to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. At its peak, the facility employed 42,000 workers and produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes, a rate of production that German and Japanese military planners had believed impossible. General Motors, Chrysler, and other automotive giants similarly converted their operations, with former car salesmen now overseeing the production of tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles. The scale of this industrial effort staggered the imagination. During the war years, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and thousands of ships. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, became legendary for their ability to construct Liberty ships in just days rather than months, using innovative assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Women workers, many of whom had never held industrial jobs before, operated welding torches and riveting guns, building vessels that would carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific. This industrial miracle required unprecedented cooperation between government and private industry. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, coordinated production priorities and allocated scarce materials. Rubber, previously imported from Japanese-controlled territories in Southeast Asia, became critically scarce, leading to nationwide scrap drives and the rapid development of synthetic alternatives. Americans adapted to rationing of gasoline, meat, sugar, and countless other commodities, accepting these sacrifices as their contribution to the war effort. The workforce itself underwent revolutionary changes. With millions of men serving overseas, women entered the industrial labor force in unprecedented numbers. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter symbolized this transformation. As women proved themselves capable of performing jobs that had been exclusively male domains, African Americans migrated from the rural South to northern and western industrial centers, seeking opportunities in defense plants. Though they faced persistent discrimination and segregation, the war years opened doors that would eventually contribute to the civil rights movement. Labor unions, which had been engaged in bitter conflicts with management throughout the Depression years, largely agreed to no-strike pledges for the duration of the war. Union membership actually grew during the conflict, and wages increased significantly as the demand for workers outstripped supply. The National War Labor Board mediated disputes and ensured that production continued without major interruptions. This cooperation between labor, management, and government created an economic engine of extraordinary power. The financial cost of this mobilization was staggering. Federal spending exploded from roughly $9 billion in 1942 over $92 billion by 1945. The national debt increased dramatically. But Americans purchased war bonds enthusiastically, viewing them as both patriotic duty and sound investment. Hollywood stars toured the country promoting bond sales, and schoolchildren collected pennies to support the war effort. The economy, which had languished throughout the Depression, suddenly roared to life, virtually eliminating unemployment and raising living standards even amid rationing and sacrifice. March 10, 1943 marked a moment when the diversity of American military service became undeniable. As the all-Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team received its colors in a ceremony that embodied both the nation's contradictions and its ideals, with young men volunteering to fight for a country that had imprisoned their families in internment camps. The American military during World War II drew soldiers from every background, ethnicity, and region, creating a force that, despite persistent segregation and discrimination, gradually began to reflect the democratic values the nation claimed to defend. The war challenged America to live up to its own rhetoric about freedom and equality. African American soldiers served in segregated units throughout the war, facing discrimination from their own military even as they fought against tyranny abroad. The Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black fighter pilot squadron, compiled an extraordinary combat record, escorting bombers over Europe and earning a reputation for skill and courage that challenged racist assumptions about black capabilities. On the ground, the 92nd Infantry Division, another segregated black unit, fought through Italy's difficult terrain. Despite their valor, these soldiers returned home to a country where Jim Crow laws still denied them basic rights, creating a painful contradiction that would fuel the post-war civil rights struggle. Mexican Americans served in disproportionately high numbers relative to their population. These soldiers often faced discrimination in their hometowns but found greater acceptance in military units where combat performance mattered more than ethnicity. Many returned home with a new sense of confidence and entitlement to full citizenship, having proven their loyalty and courage on battlefields from Normandy to the Philippines. The GI Bill would provide educational opportunities that transformed entire communities, creating a Mexican-American middle class that had barely existed before the war. Native Americans enlisted at higher rates than any other ethnic group, with approximately 44,000 serving during the war. Navajo code talkers used their native language to transmit military communications that Japanese cryptographers could never decipher, playing a crucial role in Pacific theater operations. Ironically, many of these men had been punished in government boarding schools for speaking the same language that now proved invaluable to military success. Their service challenged prevailing attitudes about Native peoples and contributed to gradual policy changes in the post-war era. Women served in unprecedented numbers, though military regulations limited them to non-combat roles. The Women's Army Corps, Navy Waves, Coast Guard Spars, and Marine Corps Women's Reserve freed men for combat duty by taking over administrative, medical, and technical positions. Army and Navy nurses served close to front lines, enduring the same dangers as combat troops while caring for wounded soldiers. Women pilots in the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program ferried aircraft across the country, tested repaired planes, and towed targets for gunnery practice, performing essential but dangerous work that military planners had initially doubted women could handle. The melting pot of military service had profound social effects. Men from small towns in Mississippi served alongside immigrants from New York. Farmers from Iowa fought next to factory workers from Detroit, and regional differences that had seemed insurmountable gradually diminished. Shared hardship and danger created bonds that transcended previous divisions. Soldiers learned that courage and competence had nothing to do with accent, background, or skin color, though military segregation policies prevented this lesson from fully taking hold during the war years. Yet discrimination persisted in painful and obvious ways. Japanese Americans on the West Coast had been forced into internment camps following Pearl Harbor. Their property confiscated and their loyalty questioned despite no evidence of disloyalty. From these camps, young men volunteered to serve in the military, creating units like the 442nd that became among the most decorated in American military history, as though they had to prove their Americanness through extraordinary sacrifice. June 6, 1944, brought news of the Normandy invasion to American radios and newspapers, creating waves of anxiety and hope that swept through communities where virtually every family had someone serving overseas. While on the home front, Americans had already been transformed by years of mobilization that touched every aspect of daily life. The war reached into every American household, reshaping routines, relationships, and expectations in ways that would permanently alter the nation's social fabric. Rationing, scrap drives, victory gardens, and civil defense drills became part of everyday existence, creating a sense of shared purpose that unified the country in unprecedented ways. Rationing affected Americans of all classes, though not equally. Sugar, coffee, meat, butter, gasoline, and countless other items required ration stamps, in addition to money. Families received ration books and learned to make do with less, stretching meals and finding creative substitutes for unavailable ingredients. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards, vacant lots, and even city parks, producing nearly 40% of the nation's vegetables by 1943. Canning became a patriotic duty as families preserved their harvests to reduce demand on commercial food supplies needed for troops overseas. Gasoline rationing hit hardest, as Americans accustomed to automobile freedom found themselves limited to just a few gallons per week for non-essential driving. Carpooling became common, and many people simply parked their cars for the duration. "Is this trip really necessary?" asked government posters, urging Americans to conserve fuel for military needs. Tire rationing proved even more restrictive, as rubber shortages meant that worn tires often could not be replaced. Communities organized scrap rubber drives, with children collecting old tires, rubber boots, and garden hoses to be recycled for war production. Civil defense preparations created a shadow world of imagined threats that never materialized but kept Americans vigilant. Air raid wardens patrolled neighborhoods during blackout drills, ensuring no light escaped from windows that might guide enemy bombers. Coastal cities took these precautions seriously, remembering that German submarines had actually operated in American waters during the war's early months. Children learned to recognize aircraft silhouettes and practiced duck and cover drills at school. The fear of invasion or bombing attacks, while ultimately unfounded, contributed to a sense of vulnerability that Americans had not experienced since the War of 1812. Entertainment adapted to wartime themes. Hollywood produced hundreds of war films, ranging from combat documentaries to morale-boosting features that portrayed American soldiers as heroic and enemy forces as brutal or incompetent. Radio programs filled evening hours with war news, variety shows featuring military themes, and drama series that brought the conflict into living rooms. Popular music reflected wartime experiences, with songs about separation, longing, and patriotism dominating the charts. The Andrews Sisters, Frank Sinatra, and Glenn Miller's orchestra provided soundtracks for a nation at war. Children grew up immersed in war culture. They collected scrap metal, bought war stamps at school, and played games based on military campaigns. Comic books featured superheroes fighting Axis villains, and toy manufacturers produced miniature tanks, planes, and soldiers. The war shaped childhood experiences in ways that would influence an entire generation's worldview. Yet children also experienced the absence of fathers, brothers, and uncles, with gold stars in windows marking households where servicemen had been killed. The pace of technological change accelerated dramatically. Radar, developed for military purposes, would later revolutionize commercial aviation and weather forecasting. Advances in medicine, driven by the need to treat battlefield injuries and prevent disease among troops, led to breakthroughs in antibiotics, blood banking, and surgical techniques. The Manhattan Project, conducted in absolute secrecy, pushed scientific boundaries in ways that would reshape global politics for decades. Synthetic materials developed to replace scarce natural resources would transform post-war consumer culture. Women's roles underwent the most dramatic transformation. With millions of men in uniform, women filled jobs previously considered male domains. Working in factories, driving buses and taxis, and managing businesses, "We can do it," proclaimed wartime posters, and women proved the slogan true. Yet this transformation came with contradictions. Women war workers earned less than men had earned in the same positions, faced skepticism and harassment, and understood that their jobs would likely disappear when soldiers returned home. August 6, 1945 dawned clear and hot over Hiroshima, a Japanese city that most Americans had never heard of, but would never forget after a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released an atomic weapon that killed approximately 70,000 people instantly and transformed warfare into something capable of ending human civilization. The Pacific War had been characterized by brutal island-hopping campaigns, kamikaze attacks, and fighting of unimaginable ferocity. But the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented something entirely new: the capacity for total annihilation. The decision to use these weapons remains controversial, but it unquestionably brought the war to a rapid conclusion and saved lives that would have been lost in a ground invasion of Japan. The Pacific Theater had always been America's war in ways that Europe was not. Unlike the European conflict, where America joined existing Allied forces already engaged with Nazi Germany, the Pacific War began with the Pearl Harbor attack and became a primarily American-Japanese struggle. The British, Dutch, and other Allied forces fought alongside American troops, but the United States dominated strategy, operations, and resources in this theater. From the beginning, the Pacific War would be unlike anything Americans had experienced before. Early defeats shocked the nation. Following Pearl Harbor, Japan seized the Philippines, forcing American and Filipino forces to surrender after a heroic but doomed defense. General Douglas MacArthur escaped to Australia, promising "I shall return," while thousands of American prisoners endured the Bataan Death March. A brutal forced march that killed hundreds through starvation, beatings, and random execution. Japan seemed unstoppable, conquering vast territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. The turning point came at Midway in June 1942, where American naval forces ambushed and destroyed for Japanese aircraft carriers, shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. The battle demonstrated both the importance of intelligence American codebreakers had deciphered, Japanese communications, and the courage of pilots who pressed home attacks against overwhelming odds. From Midway forward, Japan would be on the defensive, though retreating slowly and at terrible cost. Island-hopping campaigns followed, with names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa entering American consciousness through casualty lists and newsreels. Each island required amphibious assaults against heavily fortified Japanese positions. And often launching suicidal counterattacks. American casualties mounted horrifically, with individual battles claiming thousands of dead and wounded. Marines waiting ashore at Tarawa faced withering fire that turned the lagoon red with blood, while the fight for Okinawa cost over 12,000 American lives and 10 times that many Japanese casualties. The fighting's intensity exceeded anything in the European theater. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated with Bushido warrior codes, chose death over surrender. Civilians on Saipan jumped from cliffs rather than face capture, convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them. Kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden aircraft into American ships, sinking dozens of vessels and killing thousands of sailors. This fanaticism convinced American military planners that invading the Japanese home islands would cost 1 million American casualties. MacArthur returned to the Philippines in October 1944, fulfilling his promise and liberating the islands after months of savage fighting. The campaign destroyed much of Manila and killed over 100,000 Filipino civilians. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces pushed through the Central Pacific, drawing closer to Japan itself. American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines, sinking merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them. By 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing. Its cities were being burned by massive firebombing campaigns, and defeat was inevitable, but Japanese military leaders showed no inclination to surrender. The Manhattan Project, conducted in secrecy at Los Alamos, New Mexico, and other locations, successfully tested the first atomic bomb in July 1945. President Harry Truman, who had succeeded Roosevelt following his death in April, faced an agonizing decision: use these terrible weapons or launch a ground invasion that would dwarf the DA landings in scale and cost. August 15, 1945 became known as VJ Day, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese had never heard their emperor's voice before. Ending the deadliest conflict in human history and unleashing celebrations across America that mixed genuine joy with profound relief and growing awareness of what had been lost along the way. Times Square in New York City became the iconic center of celebration, with sailors kissing nurses, strangers embracing, and confetti raining from skyscrapers as crowds celebrated through the night. Yet even in victory, shadows loomed over the celebrations, for the war had exacted terrible costs and left America facing an uncertain future. The human cost of the war staggered comprehension. Over 400,000 American military personnel had died, with approximately 300,000 more wounded. Every community had lost sons, fathers, brothers, and increasingly in the war's later years, women who served as nurses and in other military roles. Gold Star banners hung in windows throughout the nation, marking homes touched by death. For those who returned, physical and psychological wounds would last lifetimes. Globally, the war's destruction exceeded anything previously imaginable. Estimates suggest that over 60 million people died worldwide, including approximately 27 million Soviet citizens and 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. American forces liberating concentration camps encountered horrors beyond description: skeletal survivors, mass graves, and systematic extermination facilities that revealed the full scope of Nazi genocide. Photographs and film footage from camps like Dachau and Buchenwald shocked Americans and the world, forcing recognition of evil on an industrial scale. The atomic bombs that ended the war also opened a new era of existential threat. Images from Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed entire cities reduced to rubble, with survivors suffering burns, radiation sickness, and long-term health effects that would kill thousands more in subsequent years. Scientists who had developed these weapons now grappled with moral implications of their creation. The Soviet Union's rapid development of its own atomic weapons would create a nuclear arms race that would dominate global politics for decades. America emerged from the war as the world's dominant superpower, possessing intact industrial capacity while European and Asian economies lay in ruins. The British Empire, exhausted by 2 world wars in a generation, would rapidly dissolve in the post-war years. France faced the humiliation of liberation after collaboration. Germany lay divided and occupied. Japan's cities were burned shells. China descended into civil war. Only America and the Soviet Union emerged as true great powers, and their wartime alliance quickly dissolved into Cold War hostility. Economic power brought responsibilities Americans had not sought. The Marshall Plan, proposed in 1947, would invest billions of dollars in rebuilding European economies. Motivated both by humanitarian concerns and strategic interest in preventing Soviet expansion, America would maintain large military forces overseas for the first time in its history, abandoning the isolationism that had characterized the pre-war era. The United Nations, established in San Francisco in 1945, represented hopes for a new international order, though Cold War divisions would often paralyze its effectiveness. Veterans returned home to a grateful nation, but also to profound challenges. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. The Veterans Administration, established to serve returning soldiers, faced enormous demands for medical care, mental health services, and support. Despite these challenges, most veterans successfully reintegrated into civilian life, aided by the GI Bill that provided educational benefits and home loans. The war had exposed contradictions in American society that could no longer be ignored. Black soldiers who had fought against Nazi racism returned to a country where they faced segregation, discrimination, and violence. The contrast between America's stated ideals and the reality of Jim Crow became increasingly untenable. Within a decade, the civil rights movement would challenge the racial order that had existed since Reconstruction, drawing moral authority partly from black veterans' wartime service and sacrifice. Women who had worked in war industries faced pressure to return to domestic roles as men reclaimed their jobs. Rosie the Riveter became a housewife again, at least in popular culture and government propaganda. Yet the experience of economic independence and competence in male-dominated fields had changed many women's self-perception. The feminine mystique of the 1950s would eventually give way to second-wave feminism, influenced partly by women's wartime experiences. January 1st, 1946 marked the beginning of the first full peacetime year since 1941. As millions of veterans returned to civilian life, carrying government-issued pamphlets, explaining benefits under the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, legislation that would prove more transformative to American society than anyone had imagined when President Roosevelt signed it into law. The GI Bill democratized higher education, subsidized suburban expansion, and created opportunities for social mobility that reshaped the American class structure. Its effects rippled through society for generations, though its benefits were not distributed equally across racial and gender lines. Before the war, college education had been largely limited to the wealthy and upper middle classes. Only about 15% of Americans attended college, and universities served primarily as finishing schools for elite youth. The GI Bill changed this fundamentally by providing full tuition payments and living expenses for veterans pursuing higher education. Colleges and universities, which had worried about declining enrollment with men returning from war, instead found themselves overwhelmed with applications. By 1947, veterans comprised nearly half of all college students in America. Campuses built temporary housing in surplus military barracks to accommodate the influx. Married veterans brought wives and children to college towns, creating student communities unlike anything previously seen in American higher education. Universities expanded rapidly, adding faculty and facilities to meet demand. The California Master Plan for Higher Education, developed in response to this enrollment explosion, would create the nation's most extensive public university system. The educational impact extended beyond individual advancement. Entire professions were transformed as working-class veterans became engineers, teachers, doctors, and scientists. The massive influx of educated workers fueled economic growth and technological innovation throughout the 1950s and 60s. Companies found abundant supplies of trained employees, while graduate schools produced researchers who would drive scientific advances from the space program to medical breakthroughs. Home loan guarantees provided by the GI Bill had equally profound effects. Veterans could purchase homes with no down payment and favorable interest rates, making homeownership accessible to millions who could never have afforded it previously. This triggered the greatest expansion of homeownership in American history, with rates rising from approximately 44% in 1942 over 60% by 1960. Suburbs exploded outward from city centers, transforming rural farmland into vast residential developments. Levittown, New York became the symbol of this suburban revolution. Developer William Levitt applied mass production techniques to home construction, building thousands of nearly identical houses quickly and cheaply. Veterans could purchase a Levittown home for roughly $8,000, with no down payment, making homeownership cheaper than renting. Similar developments sprang up across the country, creating suburban landscapes that would define post-war American life. This suburban expansion had complex consequences. It created wealth for millions of families as home values appreciated. It gave children space to play in yards and neighborhoods designed around automobile travel. It fueled economic growth through construction, home furnishings, and automobile sales. Yet it also accelerated urban decay as middle-class families fled cities, taking their tax dollars with them. Highways built to connect suburbs to downtown areas often destroyed urban neighborhoods, particularly minority communities with limited political power. The GI Bill's benefits, while theoretically available to all veterans, were not distributed equally in practice. Southern states administered benefits in ways that discriminated against black veterans. Universities, particularly in the South, refused to admit black students, effectively denying them access to educational benefits. Banks routinely refused home loans to black veterans or steered them toward declining urban neighborhoods through discriminatory practices that became known as redlining. These racial disparities in GI Bill benefits contributed to the wealth gap between white and black Americans that persists today. Women veterans received benefits, but faced different obstacles. Societal expectations pushed them toward traditional feminine roles rather than higher education or career advancement. Female veterans were often advised to use their benefits for secretarial training rather than professional degrees. The assumption that women would marry and become homemakers meant their access to the full range of GI Bill benefits was socially constrained even when legally available. The GI Bill demonstrated what targeted government investment in human capital could achieve. Veterans' success in education and business gave evidence against Depression-era fatalism about economic opportunity. The program created a model for later federal investments in education and housing, though none would be quite as comprehensive or generous. Its success contributed to a post-war consensus about government's positive role in promoting economic prosperity and opportunity. March 12, 1947 transformed international relations when President Harry Truman addressed Congress to request aid for Greece and Turkey. Articulating what became known as the Truman Doctrine, committing the United States to containing Soviet expansion, and effectively dividing the world into competing spheres of influence that would dominate American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The alliance between America and the Soviet Union, never comfortable even during the war, had dissolved into mutual suspicion and hostility. The Cold War would shape American domestic life as profoundly as the World War just concluded, creating anxieties and national security obsessions that reached into every corner of society. The atomic monopoly that had given America such advantage in 1945 evaporated when the Soviet Union successfully tested its own nuclear weapon in 1949. Years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The realization that Soviet bombs might fall on American cities created existential dread. Civil defense programs taught schoolchildren to duck and cover under desks, a futile gesture that would provide no real protection from nuclear weapons. Families built backyard fallout shelters stocked with canned goods and water, preparing for atomic war that might come with minutes of warning or no warning at all. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, brought Americans back to combat just 5 years after World War II ended. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea, prompting United Nations intervention led by American forces. The war settled into brutal stalemate around the 38th parallel, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Over 33,000 Americans died in a conflict that many citizens struggled to understand or support, particularly after Chinese intervention dashed hopes for quick victory. McCarthyism represented the Cold War's domestic face. As Senator Joseph McCarthy and other anti-communist crusaders saw Soviet infiltration everywhere, government employees, teachers, actors, writers, and countless ordinary citizens faced accusations of communist sympathies or disloyalty, often based on flimsy evidence or anonymous accusations. Lives and careers were ruined by blacklists and loyalty investigations. The Hollywood 10 screenwriters and directors who refused to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee were imprisoned for contempt of Congress. Fear of being labeled a communist silenced dissent and created conformist pressure throughout society. The arms race accelerated to terrifying levels. Both superpowers developed hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Intercontinental ballistic missiles could deliver nuclear warheads across oceans in minutes. By the early 1960s, enough nuclear weapons existed to destroy human civilization several times over. Military strategists developed doctrines with Orwellian names like mutually assured destruction, accepting that nuclear war would kill hundreds of millions, but arguing that the certainty of mutual annihilation prevented either side from attacking. The space race emerged from Cold War competition. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in October 1957, Americans reacted with shock and fear. If Soviet rockets could place satellites in orbit, they could deliver nuclear weapons to any point on Earth. The launch prompted urgent investment. In science, education, and space technology, President John Kennedy's pledge in 1961 to land Americans on the moon before the decade's end was motivated less by scientific curiosity than by determination to demonstrate American technological superiority over the Soviet Union. Popular culture absorbed Cold War anxieties in countless ways. Science fiction films featured alien invasions that served as metaphors for communist infiltration. Spy novels and films portrayed a shadow world of espionage and betrayal. Television shows featured heroic Americans battling communist agents. Even domestic sitcoms reinforced idealized images of American family life as superior to Soviet existence. The message was constant. American capitalism and democracy were engaged in existential struggle against Soviet communism and totalitarianism. Yet the 1950s also represented prosperity unprecedented in American history. The economy boomed as wartime industrial capacity shifted to consumer production. Suburban families purchased televisions, washing machines, automobiles, and countless other consumer goods. Corporate employment offered stability and middle-class living standards. The American dream seemed achievable for millions of families, even as Cold War anxieties haunted their dreams. This tension between abundance and anxiety defined the post-war decade, creating a society simultaneously confident and fearful. December 1st, 1955, became a pivotal date in American history when Rosa Parks, a black seamstress and NAACP secretary, refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking a boycott that lasted 381 days and launched Martin Luther King Jr. into national prominence. The civil rights movement had roots reaching back through decades of struggle. But the post-war years brought new urgency and moral clarity to the fight against segregation and discrimination. Black veterans returning from war against Nazi racism refused to accept second-class citizenship, and their demands for equality could no longer be ignored or deferred. World War II had created contradictions impossible to ignore. America had fought a war against fascist ideology rooted in racial supremacy, while maintaining its own system of racial segregation and discrimination. Black soldiers had fought and died for freedom abroad, while being denied basic rights at home. The hypocrisy became increasingly untenable as America sought moral leadership in the Cold War struggle against communism. Soviet propaganda effectively highlighted American racism, undermining U.S. claims to represent freedom and democracy. President Truman took the first federal steps toward racial equality when he desegregated the armed forces by executive order in 1948. Overcoming fierce military resistance. Integration proceeded slowly and incompletely. But the principle had been established that the nation's military would no longer operate under Jim Crow. This breakthrough demonstrated that desegregation was possible and survivable, contradicting claims by segregationists that integration would destroy military effectiveness. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown v. Board of Education in May 1954 declared school segregation unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, striking at the legal foundation of Jim Crow. Southern states responded with massive resistance, closing public schools rather than integrating them and creating private segregated academies. Federal enforcement proved weak, allowing Southern states to delay integration for years. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated the power of organized, nonviolent resistance. For over a year, Black residents of Montgomery walked to work, organized carpools, and endured harassment rather than ride segregated buses. The boycott succeeded both legally and practically, ending bus segregation and proving that sustained community action could defeat entrenched discrimination. Martin Luther King's leadership during the boycott established him as the movement's most eloquent spokesperson, articulating principles of nonviolent resistance and moral courage. Television brought the brutality of Southern racism into American living rooms in ways that newspaper accounts never had. When Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus used National Guard troops to prevent 9 Black students from attending Little Rock Central High School in September 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower reluctantly sent federal troops to enforce integration. Television cameras captured angry white mobs screaming at Black teenagers, images that shocked many Northern whites and internationalized the crisis. The contrast between America's stated values and the reality of violent resistance to school integration undermined U.S. credibility worldwide. Sit-ins spread rapidly after 4 Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, refused to leave a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in February 1960. The tactic spread to over 100 cities within months, with students enduring beatings, arrests, and harassment while maintaining nonviolent discipline. Young activists formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, bringing new energy and militancy to the movement. Freedom rides challenged segregation in interstate transportation, with activists beaten and buses burned by violent mobs, while federal authorities offered inadequate protection. The movement faced not just Southern white supremacists, but also Northern indifference. Many white Americans who opposed Southern segregation in principle resisted integration in their own communities. When Black families moved into previously all-white neighborhoods, they often faced violence and intimidation. Northern schools remained heavily segregated through residential patterns and gerrymandering of school districts. Employment discrimination, though not codified in law as in the South, effectively limited opportunities for Black workers. The movement would need to address not just legal segregation, but also the subtler forms of discrimination that characterized Northern racism. Women played central roles in civil rights organizing despite receiving less recognition than male leaders. Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and countless others organized communities, registered voters, and provided strategic direction. Their leadership challenged both racism and sexism, though the movement's public face remained predominantly male. The organizing skills and political consciousness developed through civil rights activism would later fuel the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s, as women who had fought for racial justice began demanding equality for themselves. Economic motivations reinforced moral arguments for civil rights. Segregation wasted human potential, limiting Black Americans' contributions to national prosperity. Discrimination created inefficiencies in labor markets and hindered economic development, particularly in the South. Business leaders in cities like Atlanta recognized that racial violence and resistance to integration damaged their cities' reputations. And economic prospects, while moral concerns drove the movement, economic calculations helped break down resistance among white elites. The connection between World War II and the civil rights movement ran deeper than timing. The war had demonstrated that racial integration could work, as integrated military units proved effective in combat despite predictions of disaster. Black veterans had experienced treatment abroad that contrasted sharply with their treatment at home, expanding their sense of what was possible. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy used to justify the war created expectations that America would live up to its stated ideals. Most fundamentally, the war against Nazi racism had delegitimized scientific racism and made explicit white supremacy morally indefensible in ways that strengthened civil rights arguments. By the early 1960s, the civil rights movement had achieved remarkable progress while facing entrenched resistance. Legal victories had been won, but implementation lagged far behind court decisions. Public opinion was shifting, but slowly and unevenly. The movement's nonviolent strategy maintained moral high ground, but required extraordinary courage from activists who faced beatings, bombings, and murder. The struggle would continue through the decade and beyond, but the foundations laid in the post-war years made the eventual victories possible. World War II had not created the civil rights movement, but it had accelerated forces that made the movement's success inevitable, however delayed and incomplete that success would prove to be. November 22nd, 1963 brought the post-war era to a symbolic close when President John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, marking the end of a generation's hopes and the beginning of more turbulent times. Yet the transformations wrought by World War II and its aftermath had already fundamentally reshaped America into something unrecognizable from the nation that existed in 1941. The modest, somewhat provincial country that had reluctantly entered global conflict had become a superpower, its economy dominant, its military unmatched, its culture increasingly influential worldwide. The war and its consequences had touched every aspect of American life, from family structures to economic systems, from international relations to domestic politics, creating the modern America that would face the challenges and opportunities of the late 20th century. The demographic transformation proved among the most visible changes. Suburbs had absorbed millions of families fleeing urban centers, creating sprawling residential landscapes connected by highways and defined by automobile culture. Shopping centers replaced downtown department stores as commercial hubs. Drive-in theaters, fast food restaurants, and ranch houses with attached garages became defining features of American life. The GI Bill had enabled this suburban migration, and federal highway construction facilitated it. But the impulse came from families seeking space, safety, and community in environments designed around nuclear families with children. The baby boom created by returning veterans would shape American society for generations. Between 1946 and 1964, over 76 million babies were born in the United States, creating the largest generation in American history. Schools struggled to accommodate this youth bulge, building thousands of new facilities and hiring hundreds of thousands of teachers. As baby boomers aged, they would transform each stage of life they entered, from youth culture in the 1960s to retirement planning in the 21st century. Their sheer numbers gave them cultural and political influence that would last their entire lives. Women's roles had evolved in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. Wartime employment opportunities had proven women's capabilities in virtually every field, yet post-war culture pushed them back toward domestic roles. The 1950s idealized homemakers and mothers, with popular culture celebrating domesticity and consumerism. Yet beneath this surface, tensions simmered. Educated women found housework unfulfilling. Working-class women needed employment to support families but faced limited opportunities and unequal pay. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, would articulate these frustrations and help launch second-wave feminism, but the groundwork had been laid by women's wartime experiences and the contradictions of post-war domesticity. The economy had been completely transformed. Government spending during the war had demonstrated that Keynesian economics worked, ending Depression-era unemployment and proving that federal intervention could stimulate growth. The post-war consensus accepted government's role in managing the economy, regulating business, and providing social insurance. Labor unions reached peak membership and influence, negotiating contracts that gave industrial workers middle-class incomes and benefits. Corporate employment offered security and advancement opportunities. The American standard of living rose dramatically, with home ownership, automobile ownership, and consumer goods accessible to a much broader swath of the population than ever before. Yet this prosperity was neither universal nor permanent. Agricultural employment continued declining as mechanization reduced labor needs. Family farms disappeared, replaced by large-scale industrial agriculture. Rural communities emptied as young people migrated to cities and suburbs seeking opportunities. Appalachia and other regions remained mired in poverty despite national prosperity. Black Americans, facing persistent discrimination in employment, housing, and education, participated in economic growth at lower rates than white Americans. The seeds of deindustrialization that would devastate manufacturing regions in later decades were already being planted as companies began moving production to lower-wage regions and countries. The military-industrial complex, a term coined by President Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell address, had become a permanent feature of American life. Defense spending remained high even in peacetime, supporting millions of jobs and entire regional economies dependent on military contracts. Universities conducted classified research. Defense contractors wielded enormous political influence. The permanent national security state, unimaginable before World War II, now seemed indispensable. Whether this represented necessary preparation for Cold War threats or a distortion of American democracy and economics became a subject of ongoing debate. America's global role had expanded beyond anything imaginable in 1941. Military bases dotted the globe, with hundreds of thousands of troops stationed permanently overseas. Alliances like NATO committed America to defending allies in Europe and Asia. Foreign aid programs distributed billions of dollars annually. American corporations expanded internationally, creating global supply chains and markets. Hollywood films, jazz music, and consumer products spread American culture worldwide. This global engagement brought both benefits and burdens, opportunities and obligations that continue shaping American foreign policy and domestic politics decades later. The environmental consequences of wartime industrial mobilization and post-war growth remained largely unrecognized. Factories and automobiles polluted air and water with little regulation. Suburban sprawl consumed farmland and natural areas. Chemical pesticides and industrial waste accumulated in ecosystems. Nuclear weapons testing contaminated vast areas with radioactivity. The environmental movement that would emerge in the 1960s and 70s responded to damage caused partly by wartime production and post-war consumption patterns, though the connections between World War II and environmental degradation were rarely explicitly drawn. The ultimate legacy of World War II and its aftermath remains contested and complex. The war defeated genuinely evil regimes and saved millions from genocide, slavery, and oppression. It demonstrated American industrial might and military prowess, created opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement for millions of families, accelerated racial integration, and challenged discriminatory practices. It had also created nuclear arsenals capable of ending civilization, established a permanent warfare state, facilitated suburban sprawl and urban decay, and distributed its benefits unequally along lines of race, gender, and class. For the generation that lived through the Depression and won the war, it remained the good war, a period when Americans united against clear threats and achieved decisive victory. Their sacrifices and achievements were real and worthy of honor. Yet subsequent generations recognized complexities and contradictions that the greatest generation often overlooked or minimized. The internment of Japanese Americans, the decision to use atomic weapons, the persistence of segregation, the exclusion of women from full participation, these aspects of the wartime and post-war experience complicated simple narratives of heroism and unity. By 1963, the America shaped by World War II faced new challenges requiring the same courage and unity the war had summoned. The civil rights movement demanded that America live up to its stated ideals of equality and justice. The Vietnam War would test whether lessons learned in World War II applied to post-colonial conflicts. The women's liberation movement would challenge gender roles solidified in the post-war years. Environmental concerns would question whether endless economic growth was sustainable or desirable. World War II had been a turning point, reshaping America in ways profound and permanent. The nation that emerged bore little resemblance to the country that entered the conflict. Whether Americans fully understood what they had become or where they were headed remained uncertain. But there was no going back to the world before Pearl Harbor, before the factories roared to life, before American soldiers landed on distant beaches, before the bombs fell on Hiroshima. That world was gone forever, replaced by something larger, more complex, more powerful, and more troubled than anyone in 1941 could have imagined. The America created by World War II and its aftermath would face the future carrying both the achievements and the unresolved contradictions of its transformative moment, hoping that the courage and sacrifice of the war years could be summoned again for the challenges ahead.